Hi, this is Jeremy Jansen, and I'd like to welcome you to the August 2010 issue of Reason Wizardry. This issue is the first issue that's going to use the latest version of Reason, Reason 5. Reason 5 has now been out for about a week, so hopefully many of you who have chosen to upgrade have already got your copies and are working with it. If not, you can take this as a kind of teaser for what's possible when you do get R5. So for this issue, what we're going to do is look at first what's new in Reason 5 from a sound designer, Reason Wizardry perspective, and then we're going to look directly at some of the new devices and features and some quick first look tips on how to get the most out of them. Alright, so now we're going to begin our look at Reason 5 with the Combinator. Propellerhead hasn't really been pushing the fact that they made some changes to the Combinator very much in Reason 5, but they did, and the changes are pretty good. So we're going to start with that, even though it's not really a new device and probably not that sexy from a marketing standpoint, but for Reason Wizardry, this is definitely stuff that we're going to be using for months to come. So, looks the same right now. Flip it around and show the programmer, and you'll notice that there are now 4 CV inputs for the Combinator, and this is an absolutely excellent addition because it means we can route CVs from, say, a Thor directly into the Combinator, and that's going to save rotaries that otherwise we would have wasted, perhaps sending a CV to the rotary input. Now we can send it to a CV input instead and keep all of our rotaries for useful performance parameters. I'm going to walk through exactly what that looks like in a little bit, but for now, let's move on to another new addition, and that is the organization of synth parameters. It's a little bit easier to show you than to explain. If I bring up Thor here in the Combinator programmer, you can see that now all the parameters are organized by type. So instead of having one massive large list that, if you've subscribed for some time, you've seen me go through countless times, scrolling all the way to the bottom, now you've got everything grouped nicely and easy to find without very much scrolling at all involved. So it's just one of those usability features for someone that works with Reason quite a bit. You're going to love this small change. Okay, now moving on to the Kong Drum Designer. Obviously, it's an MPC-like drum box with many different drum modules. You've probably looked into this already. It's got the NN Nano sampler, which is basically a mini NNXT. It's got a small loop player called the Nurse Rex, which is actually much more useful than it originally seems. You've got a variety of physically modeled drums and then some synthetic drums as well. So we're going to dive in depth with creating drum sounds using Kong Drum Designer in a future issue. As well, it's important to note that there are some all-new effects devices that are included in Kong. There really isn't any other way to easily duplicate the Rattler effect outside Kong. The tape echo is also very useful. And I'm really liking the overdrive and resonator. You'd think it would sound very similar to the Scream 4 overdrive and resonation, but it's actually quite different and has its own character. So it can be very useful to route sounds through Kong using its inputs. But what you'll also find is there's some significant limitations in using Kong as an effects device and modulating Kong parameters from combinators or via CV. We're going to talk about that later as well. Next, we have Dr. Octorex, which of course replaces the old Dr. Rex loop player. This time around, you're able to load 8 different loops into 8 slots. What I've found so far is that Dr. Octorex is a huge improvement from a performance standpoint, but maybe not quite so overwhelming in terms of new sound design possibilities. Of course, for loop mangling, they have added some very significant features like slice edit mode, where you can just draw in pitch, pan, level, filter frequency, even set different slices to different outputs. So it's not like Dr. Octorex is short on features. Perhaps it's just that the Kong drum designer sets such a high standard for Reason5 that my expectations for Dr. Octorex were a little bit high. Finally, the last significant feature that Reason5 has added is the new inbuilt sampling. Now, any sound that you create in Reason or outside Reason can be sampled in and then easily added to, say, a Kong or NNXT. So if you don't use audio frequently, there's no need anymore to use propeller head record. You can just stick with Reason and sample in those few sounds that you need to perfect your track. Now I'm going to get in depth with new features in the Reason5 Combinator and an example of how useful it is. The new 4 CV inputs are very useful because of combinator modulations. So just to recap from our earlier issue that discussed combinator modulations, what we mean by that is a modulation that's only possible through a combinator. So I'm going to use this Thor patch as an example, and you'll notice that the technique I'm going to show you is called sync table that I also discussed in an earlier issue. So what we want to do here is modulate the keyboard parameter, because with the simple patch I've got going on here, we get an interesting tonal change by changing the keyboard scaling amount. But that's not possible to do from the mod matrix, and neither is it possible to do using CV. So we needed to do a workaround, and that's a combinator modulation. So you'd open up the combinator programmer and set rotary 1 to affect oscillator 2 keyboard. And then you would take the LFO output, for instance, from the Thor and send that to rotary 1. But then you're left with a combinator rotary that pretty much needs to be left in the center position in order to get the modulation that you want. So you've wasted a rotary. So now we can do this much more cleanly by switching this rotary 1 source to CV input 1, and then flip the rack around and send LFO2 to CV input 1. Turn it all the way up. So you can see, using these new Reason5 Combinator CV inputs, that we can do combinator modulations while preserving all 4 of our combinator rotaries and not having to sacrifice any of them for a combinator modulation. I'll show you one more combinator modulation that's a great example of how useful the Reason5 combinator CV inputs are. One parameter that isn't modulatable again with the mod matrix or CV is the shaper on off. And that's particularly annoying because you may have heard me ranting before about how many of the shapers change the sound even with their drive at 0. So if you want to turn off the shaper completely, you really have to use the shaper on off. But it's not possible to access that parameter through the mod matrix or through CV until now. What we can do is use another CV input, let's say CV input 2, and map that to our shaper on. And now we will send this button 1, to CV output 1, and send that to our combinator CV2 input. In this case, we'll also want to switch the polarity of the CV input to unipolar because the range of the modulation that we want is just on and off. So now if we click the Thor button 1, we'll control shaper on and off. In the past, you would have had to sacrifice one of the combinator buttons to control the shaper on and off, and perhaps you had a much better use for those combinator buttons. As one final note, you may have noticed that the modulation on the keyboard rotary isn't going all the way from the very end to the other end of the range. I'm not sure if this is a bug or not, but I can show you a workaround so that you can get the maximum range out of the modulation. So the first thing we'll do is disconnect LFO2, and we'll create a explicit mod matrix line here instead, sending LFO2 to CV output 2. And reconnect that back up to the CV input on the combinator. Okay, so you still see there's no change. It's still not full modulation. But if we create another line that's identical, and increase that, it seems like we need to double the modulation amount in some certain cases. And perhaps there's a logical reason for that I haven't quite figured out yet. But for now, just know that if you don't get the full modulation range that you're expecting, that you can add another mod matrix line to Thor that's identical and just send double the amount of CV to the Reason5 combinator CV input. Kong is awesome. I want to get that out of the way first. It's an incredible instrument, and it makes creating synthetic drums so much easier than using Thor, as I did with my synthetic kits refill. Of course, with Thor, you may have more flexibility, but just the sheer ease of creating a full drum kit using Kong is completely worth the price of Reason5 admission. But there are some very frustrating limitations in Kong, and I'm going to show you those, whether you've already figured them out or not, and show you some initial workarounds that I've been using to kind of stave off the frustration. So the main problem is it's very difficult to modulate different parameters in Kong. Now, for instance, let's take this drum 1 sound, which is a hi-hat, and let's say we would like to modulate one of these parameters. Okay, what are our options? So for anything internal, there isn't any way to route, say, the mod wheel to anything here, and say to send some CV signals to Kong. We can only control volume, pitch, mod wheel, or some effects parameters. So that's out. So we're going to have to kind of look at combinator modulations as a last resort. Okay, so let's have a look here. Drum 1. We can control all of these parameters. But as far as the drum module parameters, let's go back here. All we have is DM variable. And what that means is for each drum module, propeller head has designated one of the parameters as variable. And that means that you can modulate it from a combinator. In this case, if we mouse over the different parameters, we'll find out that the variable parameter for the hi-hat is ring amount. So that's cool, but that means that we can't modulate any of these other parameters in any way. So say we move on to drum 2, our synthetic snare drum here. Let's just head back up and let's change this to drum 2 variable. And it's actually modulating the noise decay, as you can see there. But everything else, except for these common parameters, are not modulatable at all via CV or combinator. Okay, just to continue this and just show you how every different module has a different variable parameter. Here, this physically modeled snare drum, the parameter is damping. And for this synthetic bass drum, the variable parameter is tone. So while it's great that there's at least one parameter that you can modulate, it's pretty tough to accept when Kong is so incredible and there's so much room for creative synth modulation or even modulation of samples. It's really difficult to accept that limitation of here's one parameter that we've assigned in an arbitrary way, and for everything else, nothing you can do about it. So how do we work around this really significant limitation of not being able to modulate exactly what we'd like in Kong? Now, there isn't a perfect solution that I'm aware of right now, but there is a workaround that's rather brute force, but it does work well in certain circumstances. So that's what I'm going to show you first. So we're going to look at drum 1 here, and we're going to copy that drum patch to drum 5. So we've got duplicate patches on drums 1 and drums 5. We're going to send them to separate outputs. We're going to send drum 1 to outputs 3 and 4, and drum 5 to outputs 5 and 6. Now I've added 2 line mixers above, as you can see, and you can probably guess what those may be for. I'm going to first disconnect the main audio output of Kong. Now what we're going to do is use these line mixers and the two Kong drum modules to crossfade in between them. So let's take outputs 3 and 4, and then outputs 5 and 6. And then the left output from each line mixer into opposite inputs on the combinator. And now let's set up our crossfade. We'll use rotary 4. All right, now we've got our crossfade set up. Let's try that out. Well, we're not getting anything for the second drum hit because, of course, when I'm pressing a key, only one drum is playing. So what we want to do is link the two drums by putting them on a link group. So just by selecting drum 5 and then putting it on link group D, and then drum 1 on link group D as well, they're both playing at the same time. All right, so now we just need to make a change on drum 1 and drum 5 depending on what parameter we want to modulate. Since we can already modulate ring, let's try tone. So we'll set drum 5 to a very low tone and drum 1 to a very high tone. So it's certainly not perfect, and it's not a substitute for modulating the parameter directly, but since we can't do that, by crossfading between two modules with slightly different parameters, we can kind of brute force our way to a decent enough modulation until perhaps Reason 5.5 or whatever maybe comes out and solves this problem for good. Now we're going to continue working with Kong and switching over to the effects side because there are quite a few really great sounding effects in Kong, as I alluded to. And if you want to use those to their maximum, you're going to run into the same limitations that you run into with drum modules. So, for instance, the overdrive module, if we have a look at each parameter here, we have drive, reso, size, and then the different models. And now if we go up to our combinator controls, select Kong, and move down to the global effects, and move down to the global effects, you're going to notice that there are only two modulatable parameters. And this is the same for every effect, I suppose it's better than the drum modules with just the variable parameter. Here you have P1 and P2, and you can tell which parameters are P1 and P2 by mousing over them. So in this case, with the overdrive, you've got the reso is P2 and the size is P1. Now if we would switch to the rattler, we would find out that P2 is tone and P1 is level. So once again, it's arbitrary, and if you wanted to use snare tension, well, you'd have a problem. And specifically what we're going to try is to modulate overdrive, because it seems very strange to me right from the get-go to have an overdrive effect, and I can't change the drive value in any way. So we're going to tackle that in the same way as the drum modules by using crossfaded effects. So first thing is I've got a Dr. Octorex here to play a loop for us. And we're going to connect that directly up to the bus effects by using this audio input. Okay, so there it is, dry. And there it is with overdrive. So you can hear that's a pretty nice crunchy overdrive sound. We would like to modulate that drive parameter. So we're going to add a second overdrive effect. Right now what's happening is you can see bus effects to master effects. We're sending the first overdrive directly into the second overdrive in serial, and that's no good for our purposes. But luckily there is a little bit of flexibility with FX routing inside Kong. And how that works is, right here you can see these jacks break the signal flow. So if we connect up something to these jacks, we're no longer going to have the bus effects go into the master effects. So what we're going to do is split the Dr. Octorex into two parallel signals, sending one directly into the master effects right here, and one into the bus effects. So now they're no longer serial. Now they've turned into parallel effects, and they have separate outputs as well. This output is the bus effects, and the main audio output is the master effects. I've already connected those up to the line mixers, and our crossfade is set up exactly as before. So now what we should be able to do is set everything the same except for drive. And now we can crossfade between low and high drive. It's a little bit loud. Now here I've just swapped out the overdrive for some drum room reverbs, and just to demonstrate that you can do this with any parameter that isn't initially modulatable with P1 and P2. In this case, drum room has size and decay mapped to P1 and P2, but let's say that we'd want to modulate width instead. I've set width on the bus effect to 0 and width on the master effect to 127, and we can listen to the result. All right, so that should get you started with modulating just about any parameter in Kong. No look at Reason5 would be complete without checking out some of the sampling options. And I'm going to do that now. And in order to do that, I've loaded up a combinator from Synthetic Kits called Ceremonial that I created. And first, let's just listen to it. It's got an inbuilt pattern. So it's got some interesting sounds, and it certainly wouldn't hurt to sample those and maybe bring them into Kong and do some additional processing, or just play with them live, whatever you'd like to do. So let's stop that playback, open up the combinator, and figure out where we're going to start. Well, the first thing is to make sure that you're sending to the sampling input. What I've done here is, instead of sending to the regular audio output, I'm sending this combinator to the sampling input, and I'm turning monitor on so that we can hear what we're sampling. So what kind of sounds do we have? Let's first take stock. We've got a kick, kind of a ping, percussion sound, a snare, hi-hat-ish phased sound, and above that, somewhat of an overdriven bass. So those are the sounds that we're going to sample. The first thing that's important to remember is, if we have delay and reverb set up, of course those are going to be sampled, and we don't always want that. Say if we play this bass, sounds great right now, but we don't really want to record that, because when we play up and down the keyboard, pitch shift that note, of course the delay is going to be pitch shifted as well. Generally, you just don't want to record delays. So we're going to need to go into this patch and figure out how to turn off all the delays. So what do we have here? This looks like one delay. That's the bass delay. Okay, we're set up there. So now let's go through again. Our kick, nothing on that. We've got some reverb on that percussion, but it should be okay. Totally your personal choice whether you want to sample the reverb or not. In this case, I'm going to. There is some delay on that snare. So let's see if we can find that. Okay, I found it. So kick, percussion, snare, cymbal. Incidentally, I'm going to leave the phaser on this cymbal, but you can hear that obviously the phaser is being modulated, and each note, depending on when we sample, each note will sound slightly different. Like if I just play it multiple times. So it's kind of a random chance the exact sound we're going to get. If you wanted a really consistent sample, you'd turn off the phaser modulation and just have the phaser at a static frequency, or turn off the phaser altogether. Okay, and the bass is all right as well. So let's start sampling. We bring up the tool window, just click the sample button, and we'll start out with a kick. Okay, and then edit. Okay, we can use crop, and that will get rid of everything behind the sample and also in front of the sample. So we can kind of just bring the end point up here. That should be fine. We're not really cutting off any of the note. Sometimes it won't be visible, even though you'll be able to hear a little bit. So it's best just to listen before you cut off the tail of your sample. So probably can move it in even a little bit closer. Okay, now crop and normalize. And we should be good. We can save that. That's sample 1. All right, now let's sample. We're going to take our little percussion sound here. Stop, and we'll edit that. That's going to be very short, I'd imagine. Oh, well, it's got the reverb tail, and we'll try 2 seconds here. Okay, let's crop that and normalize it. You don't have to normalize it, but I like to, since then you can adjust the volume later in Kong or whatever sampler you're using. As well, we could be naming these samples. Maybe we should. We'll call this percussion. And we'll rename our first one kick. And now let's sample our snare. And edit. It's going to have some reverb tail as well. Let's see how that sounds like. Okay, crop, normalize, snare, and save. We've got our phaser hi-hat next. Okay, crop, normalize, hi-hat. And you know what? I'm going to take 2 samples of the hi-hat just because, like I said, the phaser is different every time, and we can load those into Kong and alternate between them. Or actually, maybe I'll take 3. So we'll save this, and we'll sample again. And we'll call that hi-hat 2. And one more time. Hi-hat 3. Okay, we've just got one more. We've got our bass. And we don't really have to sample that, but I'm going to just throw in a little bit on looping sounds here. So we'll sample it at C2 and maybe once at C3 as well. Okay, we will crop this right now, normalize, and now we are going to loop this sample. You don't have to, but just as an exercise on how to use the looping and how to get some decent results, we will set it to loop forward mode. And now we'll take our loop markers, move them, let's try around there, and crossfade loop, and play, and let's hear how it sounds. And this is where you can move around the markers some so that you can get the best balance between the amount of sample and the sound of the loop, I think we could probably get away with something probably closer to here. Yeah, that sounds totally fine, and it could probably be optimized even more. Okay. So actually, we can crop off the rest of that sample because we're just using the sample up to the loop. So there it is. Okay, we'll say bass C2. And we'll take one more at C3. Okay. Edit. We'll normalize it and set the loop mode. And probably a loop somewhere around here. Turn crossfade on. And that sounds fine. It could be optimized more, but that sounds fine. Bring the endpoint back here, crop. And name it bass C3. All right, so now we've got our range of samples here. We've got a snare, percussion, kick, 3 hi-hat samples, and 2 bass samples. Now we're going to load those into Kong. Okay, now we've got our samples. We're going to load them into Kong. Now, just to note, we could have recorded directly from Kong. Of course, there's the sampling button right here on NN Nano. But if you aren't quite sure what device you want to load your samples into, often it's just simpler to record them using the tool window and then load them after. It just depends on the workflow that you'd like. Actually, I decided I'm going to load those bass samples into a separate NNXT, so this works for our purposes as well. So our first sample we're going to load in is the kick sample. Just load in some more NN nanos here. Now we've got the kick. It's fairly quiet, it seems like. There we go. All right, there's our kick. And now we'll load the percussion in. And the snare. And now for the hi-hat, we're going to load them into an alternate group starting on 6. So just get some NN nanos here. I've already assigned 6, 7, and 8 to alternate group G. So when we hit one of these, they are going to cycle through the different hi-hat samples. So let's load those in. Hi-hat 1, hi-hat 2, hi-hat 3. So it's just randomly cycling through our 3 different hi-hat samples. So there's our basic recreation of that synthetic kits kit. And now, of course, you can go further and tweak the kit with different bus effects and NN nano settings, such as sample start and reverse. Let's hear how a little bit of overdrive sounds on the master effects. Okay, and now let's add an NNXT. Well, first let's wrap this in a combinator and add a NNXT. And now for our NNXT, let's load in our base samples. Base C2. They actually have to be loaded at once. You can't load them one at a time. There they are, C2 and C3. So let's just set their root notes. C2 and C3. And now auto map zones. Oh, okay, I see. I changed their root notes both at the same time. Okay, they need to be different or else auto map zones doesn't work, obviously. All right, now select them both. There we go. Our zones are set up. We'll need to add a small mixer here. Okay, now we're able to play the bass, but we're playing the Kong and the bass at the same time. So let's just set up a simple key range. And then XT starting on C2. Or we'll say maybe A1. And the Kong working below that. Obviously, our bass is somewhat limited in that we only took 2 samples. You can see here if we use select zone via MIDI, you'll see as I play up the keyboard when it actually changes to a different sample. So it's fairly noticeable, that crossover point. So if you wanted to be serious about sampling that bass, you'd want to use, just like I've probably mentioned before in Reason Wizardry, I would use probably 3 samples per octave. So for a bass like this, and maybe you want it to sound good over maybe 2 octaves or 2.5 octaves, you'd be looking at about 8 different samples. Or, maybe your song is just fine with 1, 2, or 3 samples, whatever you'd like. All right, so I'm going to save this combinator with the samples, and I'm also including that synthetic kits combinator patch in case you want to experiment sampling with it in a different way, maybe sampling with different amounts of reverb or delay. Try sampling with delay. See what I mean when I say it doesn't work very well. If you'd like to do that, go ahead. So I really hope you enjoyed this first Reason Wizardry issue that looks at Reason 5. I wouldn't say that every issue going forward is going to be completely Reason 5 material. I think that there's probably going to be a mix of Reason 4 and Reason 5 content. There's certainly much that I haven't explored completely with Reason 4. So if you haven't purchased Reason 5 yet, or you're still on the fence, it's not a complete must-have for Reason Wizardry issues going forward, but I would certainly recommend it because with the sampling and Kong alone, it's a truly incredible upgrade. Okay, so thanks again for watching this August 2010 issue of Reason Wizardry. This is Jeremy Jansen. Cheers.